Hey, Nick Digilio here. Thank you for checking out my YouTube videos. You can subscribe for free to my YouTube videos and check out the YouTube channel. Subscribe for free and all that cool stuff. And also check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/NickDShow, patreon.com/NickDShow. Become a patron there and give me some help and keep these videos going and the stories going. And on top of that, if you subscribe, and become a patron at a $3 tier or a $9 a month tier or a $25 a month tier, whatever you choose. You get some extra bonuses, including the actual story about what happened at WGN and why I got canned and how it got canned. And I'm clearing my name because a lot of crap has been out there. A lot of untruths have been out there. People writing things and making assumptions that didn't happen. I wanted to clear the story and get my story out. It's been over a year, almost a year and a half now since all this crap happened, and I want the truth to get out there. So if you want to hear about it, become a patron at patreon.com/NickDShow. My podcast is going to be starting late in January, about a month from now, at the Radio Misfits podcast network, Radio Misfits. So check it out. So I was thinking about talking a little bit about some really kind of fun stuff, and I was thinking about the first album that I ever bought. What was the first album that you ever bought? Now, if you're young, if you're really young, what was the first album you ever downloaded, or the first album you ever stole from Napster, or the first album that you put on your little Spotify network or whatever? But I'm talking about physically going out and buying albums, buying records. I started doing it at a really young age. I'm 56, so the whole record buying thing was a major part of my life, especially growing up. Used to go to 3 record stores in I grew up at Addison and Lincoln, basically. 1825 West Addison. Big greenhouse right across the street from the Cork Lounge, directly next to the Ravenswood Brown Line stop, the Addison Brown Line stop, the Ravenswood. That's the house I grew up in. So I could walk to Wrigley Field. I loved my neighborhood. And I used to shop. We used to always shop on Lincoln Avenue. That's where you went. There were no malls at that time. There were, but they were few and far between. But if you really wanted to go shopping, you could just walk south on Lincoln Avenue. And if you got to, you get to Lincoln and Belmont and Ashland, like a Six Corners area right there. And there was a Weebles, there was a Woolworths, there were all kinds of department stores, there were mom and pop shops and things like that, and record stores. There were record stores all over the place. At one point, later on, there was a Rose Records, which was right below a karate school that I signed up for and went to one lesson and left. Because for a minute, I thought I wanted to do karate, and then I realized I want to watch Bruce Lee and watch other people do karate, and I didn't want to personally do it. But anyway, so there were record stores all over the place. There was a small record store on Lincoln Avenue, which is now a Starbucks, if I'm not mistaken, diagonal across the street from Dinkle's Bakery, and Nichols Bakery on Lincoln, which I believe, yes, it is still there. And that's the record store that I went to a lot. I would go there. You would go to record stores and you would get like the WLS top 40 singles list, and you would go, I'll have number 4. And then they would go to slot number 4, and they would keep all the 45s, the singles, the 45 RPM vinyl singles, in these little slots that would correspond with the top, 50 or the top 40 records that were out right there. And then you would go, I want number 4, I want number 8, number 9. Then you would go home with a stack full of 45s. So I did that on a regular basis. So there were singles that I had when I was a kid, but there was something about that first album that you actually buy. Now, I grew up, my folks, especially my dad, very musical, couple of people. And my parents were young when they had me. My dad was in his 20s, and my mom was barely out of her teens. She was very young, I think she was 22 when she had me. And my dad was like 25, I guess. So they were young when they had me. So as I was growing up, I was in the house. I grew up with 2 people who were, who young and hip, and I got to hear a lot of really cool music. I was turned on to rock at a very young age. A lot of 70s fly jam, R&B, soul in the house. So I was lucky in that regard. I didn't have older brothers or sisters. I'm an only child, so I didn't have that wonderful moment like in the movie Almost Famous where the older sister kind of bestows her record collection onto her younger brother. Never had that. Never really had that. I had a couple of cousins who were older, had that experience a little bit, but not so much, not in the house on a daily basis. So I had to discover music on my own or through my parents. So I started to get into rock at a really young age. I started to like basically kind of the heavy stuff at a very young age. And so when I was a kid, growing up, it was all classic rock stuff. I was into, Zeppelin and all of that, classic rock kind of stuff, especially in the 70s. Way into that kind of stuff. Aerosmith. I hung out with a lot of people who blew a lot of weed. My best friend Dan, at the time, his brother lived in the basement, their parents' house in the basement, and we would go down there and it would smell real funny. He lived down there in his parents' basement. He had a water bed and the whole 70s thing. We'd go down there and it would smell like, what is that? And it was pot. And so it would smell like pot, and we would like sometimes open up his album covers, like his gatefold album covers, and seeds would fall out, because he would like have to get the seed. There was seeds in marijuana at one point. I just want to let people know. Back at some time there were actually seeds in marijuana. So you would have to get the seeds out of the marijuana, or if you were smoking a joint and there was a seed in it, it would pop and explode, and everybody would laugh, and you'd spill your Colt 45 on the floor. So we would hang out down there, and he had a great record collection, his older brother, the pothead dude who lived in his parents' basement. Fantastic, rock collection, and we used to listen to that all the time when we were kids. And so anyway, I got into the the really hard stuff when I was a little kid. My aunt, when I was 4 years old, my aunt turned me on to Zeppelin too. My Aunt Judy. She's also the aunt that taught me how to swear. She said fuck all the time. My mom would be like, will you stop, please? My Aunt Judy, will you please stop? And she would just say fuck face and fuck nose. With her, I learned how to put fuck in front of other things, and it would be funny. I never heard anyone call anyone a fuck face before my aunt, or a fuck eyes, or a fuck nose. She basically created the language that I would use for the next 50 years of my life. But I remember going over to her house, and those two cousins that I mentioned, they were her kids, and she had Zeppelin too. And I remember putting it on her record player and listening to it, and it was life-changing. Everybody has that moment where they hear an album where you're like, whoa, what is this? For me, it was Zeppelin 2. For me, it was absolutely Zeppelin 2. That was the first album I ever listened to. I'm talking 5 years old, maybe 5, and listening to it and going. And I had heard a bunch of songs, and we had 45s and singles, and I liked pop music at the time and all that stuff. But when I heard Zeppelin 2, bing, everything, it all changed at that point. And my Aunt Judy had a copy of Zeppelin 2. I listened to it, and it was all over. And that's the only album that I ever had on every format possible. Zeppelin 2. I had it on vinyl album. I had it on cassette. I had it on 8-track. And I had it on CD. So those are. I never had it on reel to reel. Reel to reel was the only format I did not own Zeppelin 2 on. My favorite Zeppelin album of all time, and kind of the album where I was like, oh, this shit's pretty cool. So, again, my Aunt Judy taught me how to say fuck correctly, and turned me on to Zeppelin, and kind of formed my musical taste at that point. So that whole love of Zeppelin that began at 5 just stayed with me. So, first album I ever bought. And I would love to leave your comments here, or on my, wherever you're seeing this, on patreon.com/Nick D Show, or at YouTube, here at the YouTube channel. I would love to hear what your first album was. What was the first album that you bought? So I remember I'd saved up my money. I was doing chores around the house, helping clean some stuff up. And I was an only child, so, they would give me whatever the hell was to do. We had cats, so I had to clean the litter box and change the litter and all that stuff. This was before you would scoop things. They didn't have the scoopers back then. It's easy now. You scoop, there's the shit, there's the clumped up urine. It wasn't like that in the 70s, man. Changing the litter box was dangerous, fumes. You would get litter all up in your nose, and you would inhale cat piss and shit. It was fantastic. But anyway, so I saved up my money, and with my earned money from my allowance that I would get for doing chores and stuff like that, my dad took me, probably 7 years old. Yeah, 73? Sounds about right. 73, I was 8. So I was 7 or 8 years old. And I always looked young. Always. A lot of people still say I look young. I'm 56, and a lot of people say that I don't look that age, although this stuff right here would indicate differently. And this little belly right here would also indicate differently. But a lot of people don't think I look 56, and I've always looked younger than I am. So when I was 7 or 8, or let's say 8 when I bought my first album, I probably looked like I was 4. I'm always little. I'm only 5'8". I'm a short dude. So I looked very young. And my dad went with me. I took my money, and I knew exactly what album I wanted to buy. I just knew. I had seen it. I'd seen the cover of it, and I had heard a little bit of it, and this was because of my friend's older brother, the pothead who lived in the basement. He had it, and we had listened to like 1 or 2 songs on it a couple of times. And I was like, that's the album I want to get. And I love the cover. I thought the cover was cool. I was into horror movies, and the cover was creepy. And, I was already by the time I was 7 years old, I was already deep into horror movies. By the time I was 8, my dad took me to see The Exorcist in the theater, so horror was my thing. So I like the hard rock, I like the Zeppelin, I like the horror. So I think you know where I'm going on what the first album I ever bought was. So my dad took me to a place called the Record Roost on Lincoln Avenue, on Lincoln, Belmont, Ashland. In fact, the entrance of it was the front entrance was on Belmont, right near Lincoln. And the back, because it had a front entrance and a back entrance. So there was an entrance on Belmont and an entrance on Lincoln. So it was on Lincoln and Belmont. You could enter on both of them. And it went through. Now, the last time I was around in that area for a long time, it was a Subway. It became a Subway. So you could get yourself a 6-inch meatball sub now. You used to be able to buy records there. And that entrance, the one entrance was on, one entrance exit was on Lincoln, one entrance exit was on Belmont. So anyway, my dad took me to the Record Roost. Got my money. My dad's like, okay, whatever album you want to buy, we'll buy it. We'll get it. You can have it. So I walk in, and I walk up to the counter, and I walk into the Record Roost, and I'd been there a couple of other times. And I walk over to the Record Roost, and I look, and I go right to the B section, and I pick up this album. So, this album. Yes. This was the first album I ever bought. Black Sabbath, Paranoid. First album I ever bought. And I knew it immediately. I went in there, I saw it in the pothead's basement little hut, in his little pot hut. And I saw this, and we listened to a few songs on it, me and my friend Dan, my buddy Dan, and that was it. I was like, that's it. This is the album that I want. This is it. This is the album right here. So, anyway, I remember bringing this up to the counter. I brought it up to the counter. And the guy behind the counter, the place smelled like pot. Everywhere you went in the 70s, fucking smelled like pot, especially if you went down to Old Town. If you went down to Old Town, as we did a lot regularly when I was a kid, my parents and I would go to Old Town a lot. It was a place I hung out a lot. Go to all the head shops, go to all the places. People were walking around. In the early 70s, hippies everywhere, people blowing weed. Weed was everywhere. So it wasn't an unusual smell for me. I just, was used to it. So anyway, we go into Record Roost. The guy behind the counter looked like a lunatic. The guy, frizzy, crazy fucking hair, grizzly beard, had like weird necklaces on. I can't remember what the t-shirt was, but he had like a weird, looked like a dirty, smelly t-shirt on. And he just looked like he just woke up, that he was on a 5-day bender, that he was between being, between acid trip number 16 of the day and, bong hit number 90 of the last half hour. He looked, like a fucking lunatic, crazy beard, 70s pothead, drunk, loony. And he's the guy working the register. So I walk up and I bring this up there. My dad's standing behind me, and I walk up and I put it in front of him, and he picks up the album. And I've got my money, I've got all my allowance money, and I'm ready to pay. I think it probably cost $2, $2.99, $3 or something like that. And he looks at it, and he looks at me, and then he looks at my dad, and he picks up the album, and he looks at my dad again, and he goes, "Are you sure you want your son to have this?" And my dad's like, what? He's like, "How old is he?" My dad's like, "What difference does it make?" And he's like, "Are you sure you want your son to have a Black Sabbath record?" And my dad's like, I want my son to have whatever my son wants. If he wants a Black Sabbath record, then yes, I want him to have a Black Sabbath record. He's like, man, I don't know. And this guy, again, looks like, if I didn't buy a Black Sabbath record from him, I could definitely buy some cocaine. Or this is pre-crack, but I'm sure crack at some point. And this guy's like, man, I don't know. Suddenly this guy's like parent of the year. The guy who looks like he should have, a number underneath his chin, like permanently, and thumbprints on the side of his face, and the word wanted above his fucking head 24 hours a day. This guy's like, I don't think you should buy this record for your son. I have whores and coke, but I don't think you should buy Black Sabbath. So my dad's like, just ring it up. So the guy rings it up. He's shaking his head. He puts this in a bag, and he gives it to me, and this was my first album. It's one of my favorite stories because the guy, we walked out and I was like, why did that guy not want his way? My dad's like, I guess because it's devil music. My dad's like, I guess Black Sabbath is Satan music. I don't know. I don't care. You like it? I'm like, yeah, okay, fine. So the whole devil music thing, Black Sabbath being, protested, and parents were like, oh my God, kid, listen to Black Sabbath, and all that stuff. My parents didn't give a shit. Like I said, my dad took me to see The Exorcist when I was 8. I was watching horror movies at a young age. I was listening to Richard Pryor at 10. So, any restrictions that parents had on their kids, I never had. And I guess that's good or bad, the way you look at it. I don't know. But as a result, 8 years old, this was my first album. Now, the album that I have here in front of me, this was given to me by my good friend Jim Hankey, who is a vinyl collector extraordinaire, who has a podcast called Vinyl Emergency. And I appeared on his podcast, and he has appeared on my radio show, and I will invite him to come on my podcast when it starts. But he got this for me and brought it to the station and said, hey, I got this specially for you. And this was a reissue that they did, a vinyl reissue that they did a few years back. It's got the gatefold, and everything. There's Ozzy. Yes, Ozzy. But the cool thing about this, besides being, one of the greatest albums ever recorded in the history of music. By the way, if you don't own the first 6 Black Sabbath records, you have an incomplete record collection. This is not an opinion, it's a fact. If you think you have a great record collection and a complete record collection, but you don't own all 6, the first 6 Black Sabbath records, you don't have a complete record collection. Get to it. Fix that. The first 6 Black Sabbath records. I've seen a picture of a girl online. They have a T-shirt. In fact, my old producer Tom Hush has a T-shirt that says, "You can only trust yourself and the first 6 Black Sabbath records. Truer words have never been put on a T-shirt or spoken." So what's great about this is that this, Jim got it for me a few years ago. It's vinyl. It's awesome. But this is the cool thing. Aside from it being one of the greatest albums of all time, look at this vinyl. Is that not the coolest thing you've ever seen? Really crazy design. There's a little like design in there, and it's purple vinyl. Look at that. Yeah, with the original label, Warner Brothers label, but it's on purple crazy design vinyl. Yeah, love it. So, and I thank Jim Hankey for getting that for me, because he knew that Paranoid was the first album I ever bought. And then since then, albums were a big thing. In the 80s, my friends and I, my buddies, Joe, John, Scott Oaken, my buddy, Dan, Len, we would all go to Rolling Stone like every night. We would go to Rolling Stone at Harlem and Irving, which is still there, and we would buy albums constantly. Throughout the late 70s into the early 90s, I'm not kidding, we were there like at least 4 times a week buying records. Anytime we went to a movie at the Norridge, Rolling Stone was where we went afterwards. If we didn't have anything to do, we'd go to Rolling Stone. And I had a stack of, I have albums are distributed in different places. I have some here, I have like the ones that I like to listen to because I have a turntable in my apartment here. There are some that I still have, but a lot of my albums are like in boxes and they're in storage, or they're at my parents' house, or they're someplace else. But in the 80s, throughout the 80s, album buying, was a nightly occurrence. So I remember being there like when the door opened at Rolling Stone, when Around the World in a Day came out, the Prince album. I was there like the moment the doors opened, I was there. So albums, really, really cool. Obviously people are now buying vinyl like it's crazy. But yeah, that was the first album. This was the first album I ever bought. The guy was very reluctant to sell it to me because I looked like an impressionable little kid who should not be listening to Black Sabbath, even though he looked like a drug dealer. Went home and listened to Paranoid constantly, and from that point on, I was hooked. The Zeppelin, the Sabbath, the classic rock, all of that stuff. That was my obsession in those days. Secretly, I loved disco. Secretly, so. But anyway, what was the first album you ever bought? Do you have a story behind it? Did a clear, insane drug dealer try to not sell you the album like they did to me? Anyway, so that was it. I just wanted to share that. And again, thanks to Jim Hankey, Vinyl Emergency. He has a really cool podcast. And you can check out my podcast, Radio Misfits Network. Radio Misfits Network. It's going to be great. It starts in January. And thanks. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. And leave your comments. Your first album of all time. That's what I wanted to hear. All right. Enjoy the veal.